What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and you're listening to Homebrewed Christianity, where since the year of 2008, we've been bringing you interviews, conversations with some of the best scholars, thinkers, and today is a special episode. It is a crossover episode with my friend Chase from the Faith and Capital podcast. So if you're a regular to the Faith and Capital podcast, you'll be like, oh, it's Chase and Trip. It's a crossover episode. If you're not, then you're going to get to meet Chase, and you could definitely go check out one of my weekly regular podcast listens, the Faith and Capital podcast. We have a lot of fun in this episode. Chase has 5 reasons you should go Democratic Socialist, right? So if people have been asking, they've been saying to me, Trip, when are you going to have some theological reflection on our current economic situation? When is religion going to bring a critique to the economic order? What are we going to do about this, Trip? And I said, hey, I'm going to do a crossover episode with my new friend Chase. And then I'm going to do the next homebrewed reading group called Capital Change with friend of the pod, legendary theological ethicist Jörg Rieger. That's right. I'm doing a class called Capital Change with Jörg Rieger. It is all about the end of religion and business as usual. It'll be a 6-week exploration of economic justice and religion. Starting later this month, we got 6 different live sessions, 3 interactive webinars with some of our partners, and there's an online community all around it. But you want to sign up now. You want to go to mammonorgod.com, mammonorgod.com. And we're going to have 6 sessions. Session 1, we're going to say, hey, we know we're being screwed, so why do we keep going? You know that? That's what we're exploring in the first one. Like deep down, more and more people are realizing that our current economic situation isn't working in their favor. So why do we keep supporting it? Are there alternatives? What are they? What part or role might religion play in becoming part of the solution rather than the problem? That's just, you see, session 1, that's what we're exploring with Jörg Rieger, who is the Distinguished Professor of Theology and the Cal Turner Chancellor's Chair of Wesleyan Studies, founding director of the Whelan Cook Program in Religion and Justice at Vanderbilt University. Oh yeah, so go to mammonorgod.com, mammonorgod.com. Sign up. It is an open online course. You can donate whatever you want. You don't have to donate. We just want to get as many people together as possible to investigate religion, a source of critique of our current economic order. mammonorgod.com. Oh, and just so you know, the first of our webinars on engaging Christianities and socialism that the Whelan Cook program is working with the Institute for Christian Socialism on is March 8th, is coming up next week. And it features Cornel West and Angela Kozer. So they will be joining Jörg Rieger for some excitement. That's right, Cornel and Angela joining. So get on it. Go to mammonorgod.com, sign up, join the class, get access to the webinars, and have yourself a good old time. And one last thing before we jump in with Chase. A number of you considering joining this class may say to yourselves, I mean, I can see wanting to have a religious critique of the economic system, but you use the socialist word. Well, the class itself is looking to explore these issues so you can learn more about it. We don't think everyone that signs up has to be on board for everything. And in fact, I imagine Jörg and I will be pushing back and forth with each other. But, you know, so many of you that are part of the Homebrewed community have asked for this class, and it's happening. mammonorgod.com. All right, here we go. Fun with Chase from the Faith and Capital podcast. Enjoy. Hello, everybody. This is Trip, and today on the podcast is a fellow podcaster, Chase Tibbs, who runs Faith and Capital. So, Chase, thank you for joining the podcast all the way from North Carolina.
All the way from your home state, right?
Oh, yeah. I know. I'm just
Cool.
like, you mentioned where you live, and all of a sudden I think of Bojangles.
Oh yeah, I haven't actually had Bojangles yet, but I was actually thinking we were talking earlier about Gastonia, which is like
Hmm.
20, 30 minutes away from me,
Hmm.
and actually just got an awesome book called The Proletarian Journey, which took forever to get here because it had to be shipped from India, but it kind of brings in some of my favorite things. One thing, it's about Gastonia and about communism. So
In
I just
Gastonia?
yeah, some labor struggles. There were some really incredible militant labor strikes there, and it got super bloody. The bosses basically dragged some workers out, shot them in the head. It's like
Oh man.
historical.
No,
Yeah, really intense.
I need you to send me a link to it because my brother is senior minister at First Baptist in Gastonia. He
Oh
just
my
finished
word.
reading Capital Volume 1, and
Oh,
we've been like
excellent.
going back and forth on this, and he's like he went in this whole explanation of and here's how all these things played out in Gastonia because he's been doing
Wow.
research on the history as part of this movement to get rid of their Civil War monuments. Um,
Interesting.
you know, one, it's just cool to have text messages back and forth where you find out other people you love and think with get as
Yeah.
disturbed
Mm,
by like taking seriously Marx's kind of critical assessment
yeah.
of the history and development of capitalism, right? And I think it makes you have to write that, like, ask better questions
Yes.
because for so many American Christians, especially post from the Cold War on, there's this like assumption that nationalism, free market capitalism, and Jesus are just like tag team buddies, and they're just ready to pillage all the evils like socialism and communism and
Mm,
terrorism and all these things that just limit freedom and liberty. And underneath that, like that hooking together of kind of militarism, nationalism, economism, and religion it's like binds together and creates this giant master signifier that we just call like being American. uh,
sure.
and underneath it are this mass of poor, right? And the brilliant thing about at least the first time I read Marx was it helped me as someone that grew up in rural North Carolina recognize that what we start to see is if you pay attention the historic injustice to Native Americans, to African Americans in America, that the system's also doing it to an overwhelming majority of poor white people.
Yeah.
And that doesn't have anything to do with the fact, right, that there's like no variable in their thinking for the poor, the planet, and non-human life and stuff. So
Absolutely. And even if like a listener is like, well, I'm white, but I'm not poor. That's an interesting kind of way that we've been taught to think of ourselves too, right? To identify as not poor. Because I mean, as workers, right? I'm a worker, and on one hand, I have all my needs met, and a little bit more, but I also am paying decades of debt. I'm also completely excluded from what happens from the decision making that happens in my community and my neighborhood. And so while I have, I got to go to school and I got, a master's degree and I have a job and my partner and we make perhaps relatively more than a lot, literally tens and perhaps hundreds of millions of U.S. Americans do. We are still wrapped up in the oppression and the exploitation that's happening here and across the world. And I think that to me is like what socialism and Christian communism, that's what this is about, is helping people see the solidarity and the common interests we have, rather than say, well, there's people worse off than us and we should do something for them because of love for them, even though it has nothing to do with me. It's like, yes, it does. It has everything to do with the masses of working class people. Even if you make, I don't know, $50,000, $60,000 a year, I wish I'd like to make that. But even if you make $100,000, I think that people are in the working class, right? Not this middle class, but idea. But if you're exploited by a worker for wages or a salary, whatever you want to call it, then I think we have serious common interests. If you are not in the ruling class. And that's an important distinction, I think, that we have to take seriously. But you're right. there are some ideological kind of allegiances to American identity, to middle class identity, to white identity that makes us believe that, well, we don't have in common with our fellow working class folk.
Yeah. And I think that kind of, whatever is in American water that they drink that the rest of kind of developed Western countries don't have, became so much more clear after moving to Scotland and then being here during a pandemic. Right. So move here and like, I work at a university. I also have a podcast I make money off of. And, I'm in a neighborhood next to families that are just cab drivers and they own homes and their kids go to college. Guess what country that is not a possibility in? The United States of freedom, love, and liberty, America. That you're going to be having a 3-bedroom home that you own because you're both cab drivers. No, they're going to work for Uber. And they're going to, even in liberal states like California, have their ability to organize undercut by the liberal state, right? So, and then you have the lockdown happen. What happens here? The government steps in and covers 80% of everyone's wages so they can stay home during a lockdown. It doesn't happen in the United States. But you just see the way the collective sense of the identity of people in Scotland for each other is a lot tighter than in America, and the way the NHS, other things like that, right? Well, you would get giggled at and called a Bernie bro probably for suggesting half of it. And in the UK, even the ones that are like you'd think of as conservative are like, no, it's good, like because we're all neighbors. So obviously we do these basic human dignity things together.
That's interesting. Yeah, I'm really unfamiliar with current or most recent Scotland politics, but what I do know is that, capitalism in part emerges on the colonization and the invasion of Scotland from an emerging imperialist capitalist nation. So I think that's kind of interesting, especially kind of comparing that to the US, who we've spent the last several centuries doing the opposite. We've been the imperialists. We've been the ruling capitalist nation rising to power. And we've expanded our power, not just west of the Mississippi, as they were aiming for in the 18th century, but now literally across the entire world, 900 plus military bases that we know of across the entire world.
Yeah. Which don't come free either. Right?
No, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
They also don't bring us back large amounts of profit. It Absolutely. Is a whole sinking of investments. So right.
They don't. Yeah. They don't bring U.S. American, like the working class profits, right?
Right.
That money, that blood-soaked, just kind of sin-drenched, violent money goes to the hands of the ruling elite. Which I don't want that money, right? I want to crush imperialism, and we want to crush colonialism. But a lot of folks do identify as like, oh well, if we invade Iraq, that's good for us. Like there's an us. There's not an us between me and Jeff Bezos. There's not an us between me, my coworkers, and the Walton family. Yeah, I think that's an interesting kind of assumption that a lot of U.S. Americans, whether you make $20,000, $100,000, or I don't know, $5 million a year.
Yeah, and the thing I think that strikes me about a conversation about being a Christian and being a socialist is the tension and uncomfortability large portions of the church have just by asking the question, right? That in and of itself is revealing, because it seems like once you start to read the scriptures and then think about the history of the church and what the witness of Jesus is and the call to justice in the people of Israel and all things, like you would at least like want to think about it, or at least not get uncomfortable when you ask that question. Clarence Jordan, who was a Baptist and he started like an integrated community on a farm, Koinonia farm in Georgia, in the 50s on up. He had this sermon that he was giving at the Southern Baptist Convention back before it became all fundamentalist. and in the middle of it, he paused, like when people got real awkward when he's telling a story about kicking someone out that was a Klans member. And he goes, well, if you think that's awkward, just imagine being a Christian and no one ever calling you a socialist or a communist. Like, and he goes in like, it was like he got awkward and then just goes this whole thing. He goes, I'm not saying you have to be one. I'm just saying some of those people should think you are. And just because if you just care about the things Jesus was deeply passionate about, that's the label that gets attached to you by the dominant regime who wants to ignore, deny, and then put responsibility on the oppressed person for their own oppression.
Yeah, King has a similar interesting situation where he has this sermon. It's unfortunately it's anti-communist. It's the question of like, can a Christian be a communist? Unfortunately, I think he fails. Perhaps at the end of his life, he has a change because he actually ends up becoming explicitly anti-EU imperialist and sides with the communist Vietnamese anti-colonial struggle, right? So, but he has one of his points is like, well, hopefully communism will be a helpful redirection, a kind of a critique of Christianity for where it is, because he says it's shit, basically, right? It's super racist. It loves profit over people, and so he actually says, well, actually, hopefully, communism will be a correct, like a correcting kind of force for what Christianity has been and currently is at his time.
Yeah, I mean, he talks about the Martin Luther King Jr. the kind of the three evils in America, as militarism, nationalism, and racism, and like it's not surprising, right? Like that if you're dealing with those, if those are the evils you're threatening, then you show up for worker strikes with on a consistent basis. And I think that that moment, like the way the church turned King into a symbol of judge people by the content of their character, it became like a way to short circuit his prophetic analysis, right? So like he's pointing out, like in Vietnam, like, what are all these people going to Vietnam? Because the system doesn't have a place for them, and they're being exploited and oppressed, and they're going to fight the 1%ers war, right? Like we have Jim Crow running across the South. You don't really want democracy, and now your economic oppression so much that the civil rights movement's partnering with a bunch of redneck white guys who collect trash. Right? Like you start to see in the way he starts to, when he does his own analysis that begins in the South and thinking through organizing against Jim Crow and stuff, like it grows to where he sees this and raises to the American conscience this battle going on at the heart of American democracy. Which way are we leaning in the dream we were given? Is it the one that continues to judge itself on the possibility of greater justice and liberty? Or is it the one that, internalizes its vile, perverse top-down power into itself and then projects, goodness and light on everything, right? And just like calls it freedom and liberty. I think his, like when we turn his kind of collective prophetic vision into something that's like just treat everyone equal, then you can see happening to King in America what the church did to Jesus, right? It's like, let me find the few parts that are completely compliant with a death dealing system that we have, celebrate them so much that someone that just repeats back to you what King or Jesus or someone like that says, the people don't even recognize it. When I was in Los Angeles, I was a minister at a very large, majority 1%er church, 800 members UCC church. And one time I did the Sermon on the Mount without telling anyone as my sermon. Like I just did it, but not where I'm like saying as Jesus, right? Like, but I say unto you, I didn't do that, but it was like just the content of it. After it, had someone come up between services and say, now I really like, that was a provocative sermon trip, but for the second service, which is the older, richer, more conservative service, you might want to dial back some of that hippie rhetoric. And this person, longtime member of the congregation, she's completely well-intentioned. She likes me and is like, trip can be strategic and help us push on different issues. And like, she was telling me from my own interest. And I was like, that was like Jesus. Like I just said, everything I said was just like a Sermon on the Mount.
That's a lot.
And this person could be a committed at a progressive UCC congregation in Los Angeles. And still, you just hear the Sermon on the Mount. You're like, that hippie socialist thing. You might want to dial that back. And so, like, I think today in this moment, like your podcast, there's a whole group of podcasts and then online groups of younger Christian, basically like millennials and younger, who are going, Christian socialism might not just be something to think about again. It might be necessary to embrace if the gospel we proclaim has something good to say about the most pressing challenges we face. We can't like do this, capital washing of the prophetic gospel anymore.
Absolutely.
That was all of our intro before he was Chase's 5 reasons.
Well, I'll definitely keep these shorter because I'm sure folks don't want to listen to this for too long. But yeah.
Oh, you misunderstand how homebrewed episodes go. They can go an hour and a half easy, Chase. Like the people just plus you can turn it on 2.5 speed.
I do that. I definitely go like 1.5. 2 is like sometimes I can't really make it out, but no.
If you lived in Los Angeles long enough and had 2 hours each way in a car during the day, you could train yourself to. It's like speed Olympics on listening.
That's true. And that's funny.
When I was in my PhD program, back then I downloaded like all of the Richard Wolff lectures I could find, and then would just listen to them on the way to school. And so like certain voices, I'm even better at fast. Like this Richard Wolff, David Harvey, I could just like crank them up because I'm like, oh yeah, I know their voice.
That's hilarious. Yeah.
All right, but cool. So we're going to do 5 reasons. 5 reasons to go Christian Socialist. So what's number 1, Chase?
Let's do it. Well, so you actually helped me with this first one, and I really liked it. The first reason to go Christian Socialist is that Pharaoh sucks. And by Pharaoh, yeah, absolutely true story. It's actually in the Bible about how Pharaoh sucks. And I'm thinking about the pharaohs of our daily lives, and I'm thinking about our bosses. Our landlords, our lenders. Just for a second, let's start with our bosses. Like when I'm thinking about how our pharaohs, the pharaohs in our lives suck, I'm thinking about how I've worked with people who they've been strapped for cash, or they've been mistreated at work. Maybe they're overworked, or they're understaffed, or they're underpaid, or maybe they don't have the best health coverage, right? That's stuff that's coming from our bosses, right? And that sucks because that affects like our emotional lives, our friendships, our family lives. And so I think that's one way that I think the bosses and the pharaohs of our lives suck. We have landlords. Landlords are like, well, I don't care if there's like a capitalist induced pandemic going on. I want my money. And folks are like, well, I've just been out of work for a couple weeks, 2 months, 6 months. Folks are going to be out. Some folks are going to be out of work for years. And that to me is a really sucky pharaoh. Lenders. How in the world would we imagine a world where we pay hundreds of thousands of dollars just to have a roof over our head, right? If you are able to purchase a house, or even just consistently, $1,000. Some people are paying more than $2,000 for rent, right? So I think lenders suck. And then the last group of pharaohs that I popped in my mind were imperialists and colonizers. The things that indigenous folk have to deal with all across the world, but I'm particularly speaking from the settler colonial state of the United States. The violence and the degradation and the suffering that has been imposed upon the people, the many nations. It wasn't just one group of people, right? It was hundreds of different nations that existed here before, and we continue. It's not something we did in the past. We continue to violate their well-being, to undermine their capacity to live, as a sovereign. We continue to kind of exploit both their land and their bodies. So I would say those pharaohs suck. And actually, I'm a part, if I may, I'm a settler. I'm wrapped up in that pharaohhood, if I may. And I don't want to be a pharaoh. So first reason to go Christian Socialist is that pharaohs suck.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that is kind of implicit there is that like this scripture is based, like the founding event of the people of Israel is that God took sides.
Yes.
Like God takes sides, and God took sides against Pharaoh. Now, I'm not saying, like you said, like there's this sense that today things are so complicated and connected. Everyone's implicitly connected in ways that compromise, right? Some myth of like pure goodness or whatever. But that doesn't mean, as people of faith, we shouldn't say, as complicit as I am with whatever agency and influence I have to say, let my people go. And sometimes for people of privilege, that means talking to yourself. Right? Like in figuring out what are the ways you've internalized the logic of Pharaoh. And the thing about Pharaoh's logic is it's not just death dealing to the least of these. It's death dealing to your firstborn. Right? Like think of how many people who are absentee parents because they've internalized that get more, build more, have more logic of Pharaoh. How many of our families, our friends, our relationships are impoverished because we were alienated from our relationships in our community to jump through the hoops of success so that we can be affirmed by the market affirmation of Pharaoh. Pharaoh has no interest in your well-being unless you're more interested in the system's advancement. And I think that like once you get that, and I think there are more people waking up to this, right? Like think of how many of our friends were told by their parents, like, here's how you win in America, right? You do good in school, you go to college. It's okay to get student loans, right? Like, because you got to go to the best places and you build network and you get the resources, and then you're going to have this career just like I did and like your grandparents did. And then what happened? We got triple the amount of student loans, start at half the pay rate they got, and then they look at you like you're lazy and complaining about it on the internet, right? They're like, nah, build more bricks. And you're just like, this can't be good. Anyway, sorry.
No, that's great. Like, is there a second job that you could kind of go? Is there a second brick maker that you could go work for, Trip? I'm just I care about you, and so I'm just wondering, have you been responsible with all of the wages that you've made as a brick maker?
Yeah, you like craft beer too much. You would probably be rich if you didn't like craft beer, Trip.
Exactly.
The when I was in California, back in the day, California, if you basically like did decent in college, everyone went to college for free at the big UC schools. So I was talking with two elderly gentlemen that were UCLA alumnus that are both multimillionaires who were complaining about some of our youth that had graduated high school that couldn't afford to go to the community college. And they're like, why parents aren't preparing for their kids anymore and all this kind of stuff. And I said, well, how much debt did you have when you finished undergrad? And they're like, oh, I didn't have to take out any loans. And I was like, well, what did it cost? Well, no, that we didn't really pay for it. And I was like, oh, okay, I get what you're saying. So you've made millions of dollars at the benefit of going into a better economy than our current youth at your own church had. And your grandparents paid tax money to cover every kid that graduated at public high school to go to UCLA for free. And now you're bitter that I'm asking you to help pony up some money of your millions of dollars you made off not investing in their future because you wanted your tax money back, to actually just help someone at your own church go to a community college. Then I got really reprimanded for my tone and directness during that conversation, but they did feel guilty enough to give the scholarship money. And I was just like, whatever's going through your head right now that you think they don't deserve it, but you earned what you have, is just like, it's a demonic ideology and you need an exorcism. And they were not thrilled with my directness, but
no, that's
I think it's a good example of how it works,
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's a really great way of thinking about it, right? We all have a little pharaoh inside our head, and that pharaoh needs killed. We need to kill the pharaoh inside our head that encourages us to live in ways that are not life affirming, which is kind of my second point for becoming Christian socialist. So I grew up in evangelicalism, a white evangelicalism, but one of the things that my parents in particular, my dad was the pastor and my mom was my principal, right? But one of the things that they always kind of instilled in me were that relationships matter and that we should love people. That was just a part of our language and our way of talking about what it meant to be Christ, or what it meant to love God and love people as Christ would. And so for me, I think a second reason to become Christian socialist is that our relationships should actually matter, right? And that if we're called to love our neighbors, that we should think about the kinds of communities and structures and systems that would allow us to better love our neighbors. I just talked with, had an incredible conversation with Dr. Edgar Rivera Colon, and we talked about kind of anthropology, or thinking about it in terms of being or becoming human. And for me, when I think about being human, I think about how do we get to relate to one another? How do we get to exist in relation materially and kind of in an embodied way, actually in the world? And so I think that's a really important question for me, is what ways of being in relation, being human, do we believe we're called to embody? And why can't we live in those ways? Like, one example is that, like, I would love to spend more time caring for and loving on my friends, my community, my neighbors. But guess what? I have to go to work. I can't not work. And on one hand, it's because I need the wages. And so, yeah, I think that's an interesting kind of way of thinking about becoming Christian socialists, is what kinds of relationships would we like to live in, and why? What are the systems, right? How is capitalism, white supremacy, and heteropatriarchy all wrapped up together, forcing us to relate to one another in ways that basically commodify one another, right? I see you as someone who can perhaps expand my capital, or at least perhaps I see you as someone who's not going to drain my limited wealth. And therefore we kind of encounter each other in that kind of non-human way. I don't really trust you as a friend. You picked up the beer tab last week, Trip. And so I'm kind of counting. I'm like, well, do I have to pick it up this time? Right. So anyways, I think the relationality is a really interesting piece for why we should become Christian socialists.
Well, and I think that's like important. And one of the ways I've seen a lot of younger ex-evangelicals go Christian socialist is because they really believed what their parents told them and what their minister said, right? Like, God is love, and it's all about relationships. And then what happened is, if you are in a generation that becomes extremely aware that there are relationships you're engaged in that are not just the physical face-to-face ones, right? That the market is mediating your relationship with your neighbors, that our militaristic structure is mediating your relationships with people we're told are our enemies, that all of your consumption patterns are connected to exploitative labor, exploiting the planet, and that all these relationships that you're actively engaged in, right, have been silenced, because the ones that we were told to focus on, right, is like, did you forgive your friend or your partner or your family member? And are you doing charity for those you see in need? And all these type of things, none of which is like wrong. It's just that a Christian socialist goes, as much as it matters to be loving to your actual neighbor who had a tree fall on their roof, right? It also matters to be loving to the children who are in mines getting the materials to build your phone, or for the 2 generations out who are wanting to know if our great grandkids get to breathe, right? Like, there's so many relationships you have material connections and consequences to. It's just, it's mediated by the market. And so we think, well, the market must do it best and do it good, right? That's the part that Christian socialists are challenging. Not that you aren't connected to it. It's just that these connections you have to think about them ethically, because the market isn't inherently good. And we just have physical evidence, right? Like the millions of people on crosses built by our economic machine testify against the generosity of the invisible hand. And I think evangelicals just assumed well, there's a long history behind it, but for reasons that were intentionally manipulated, I think, that we don't have to ask what the market does. But I think more and more people are aware, be it the ecological crisis, the listening to the testimony of like liberation theologians and the people that have the boot of capital on their throat in our own culture, that we can't make that assumption. And so if we're going to live in integrity with the love of God in relationship, then you have to get critical about those connections. And there's this like great resource of thinking critical about relations in the Marxist tradition.
Yep, absolutely. And expanding upon like what I hear you talking about with the market, for me, socialism and communism is also about a particular relationship that occurs around the means of production and the production of the means of subsistence, the stuff that we need to literally survive. And so there are some people in our communities, and then there are even fewer people across the world, right, who own the productive forces, the things that we need to produce food and shelter, and also even things like music, right, or cars, transportation, right. And so I think that's the question for me that I want folks to think about is there such thing as a just relationship between a boss and then the masses of workers? Can there be a just and mutual relationship between a landlord and tenants and renters? Because there's a hierarchy, a differential of power that one very, very small group wields against the majority. And I think those are the kinds of relationships that we kind of encounter often. We talk the lender or the debtor, but then it really expands and we start to think, well, there's really like a ruling class within each and every one of our capitalist countries that they politically, they have the power to determine what is education like, what is transportation like, where, what kinds of labor will be available for what groups of people at certain parts of the country, right? And then we think about it in the entire world. And so these are the kinds of relationships that are encircled around who owns and who is excluded from owning the means of production, because it's also about governing our lives, governing our labor. As I first started talking about, I don't get to decide how little or how much work I have to do. There is a minimum, and it's a good 40 to 50 hours a week. I don't want to have to work like that. But the relationships that this world has imposed upon me force me to live in those relationships.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Even like on the amount of work, the assumptions Americans make about like why America's better, is that they do work 50 hours a week, as opposed to like if you work full time in the UK, it's 35 hours, or if you're in France, it's a little less, right? And then that you get shamed if you don't take your 6 weeks paid vacation here. It's like all these Americans, they aren't going to use their vacation. This is how it starts. Versus in the States, like how long do you have to work somewhere before you get 6 weeks paid vacation? I guarantee you most postdocs don't get 6 weeks paid vacation.
Yeah, I have no idea.
you know what I mean? So like those basic things, just between other Western countries, the American ideology is our superiority is connected to having internalized Pharaoh's logic. You're like, I didn't use all this vacation. You're like, congratulations. I'm glad you didn't spend time doing things that deeply matter to you and just contribute to the overall well-being of your family, community, and society. Like, you should have worked more.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it really goes back to that question of like, well, how do we think about what it means to be human? Is being human producing money, or just simply monetarily providing for our loved ones, right? Is that how people really want to think about and define human being? Or must we imagine other ways of being human, as you said, about that's grounded in actually caring for one another and spending time together. So cool. The third one, to keep it moving, the third reason that I think that I would encourage folks to become Christian socialists is that capitalism isn't just some kind of economic system outside of social and political forces like race, gender. It's a deeply political and social, historical reality. And so for me, if listeners are like, are interested in are committed to, say, realizing a world of Black freedom, a world constituted by indigenous sovereignty, and also sexual and gendered liberation, there is none of those three things. There is no kind of Black freedom, or there's no way of actually addressing white supremacy and anti-Blackness and colonialism across the world if you let capitalism stay in place. It is so driven towards expanding and increasing profits that capitalism and white supremacy and heteropatriarchy, those are intertwined and they're inseparable. Sylvia Federici did a great book called Caliban and the Witch, in which she talks about basically for capitalism to emerge, it had to revolutionize the way in which men and women thought of themselves. It revolutionized gendered relations, and it forced women, kind of pushing them away from having any kind of economic and political power in their communities towards these like private nuclear family houses. So anyways, I think that's just a great example, one of many, that if we want to take things like racial justice and gender justice, social justice seriously, I think we also have to take the ways in which capitalism is wrapped up inseparably with those systems. And I, personally, I want to push back against like any idea that says, well, which one's like the supreme? I'm not interested in looking for one system that's like more important or more powerful than the other. They're inseparable. And so we have to attack them all simultaneously.
Yeah. And I think that there is like an important part to that is that when you take out reflection about class analysis, then a lot of the moves towards different types of inclusion, recognition, and affirmation become means of including people into an exploitative system rather than transforming the system to be more life-giving to all of the different bodies that are a part of it, right? And so, like, people can get really thrilled that there's different people with different identities included in the leadership of neoliberalism in different places, be it economically, politically, and that type of thing. But when you alienate the class analysis from the kind of identity politics issues, then you may end up getting recognition and inclusion into the system. But if the system itself is already perversing our relationships with this type of top-down exploitative power, then you just get them. You don't end up with the type of revolution that we're hoping for. And that's why. But in the same way, like if you just do class analysis and don't pay attention to historic injustices in the way that like heteronormativity affects things, then you just look obnoxious and aren't into the whole thing. So.
Absolutely. Yeah. Like class reductionism is just flat out wrong. It's actually, in my mind, a failure to understand what class really is, because capitalist class relations emerge as racialized and gendered relations, right? And so in today, the heteropatriarchy and the kind of global white supremacy that persists, those are capitalist relations, right? They're simultaneously one and the same thing. And at times, I think it's important and helpful to kind of approach one at a time. But I think there's just been a plethora of Black radical tradition and revolutionary feminist writing and organizing that has helped to reveal that, say, like Black capitalism isn't going to help the majority of Black capitalists. On one hand, it's actually disproportionately still going to benefit the ruling like white class, ruling white capitalists. But it's also, if it does help anyone, it's going to help like a few individual Black folk here in the US and not the vast majority. And the same thing could be said with, say, like gendered justice. Having more female landlords isn't going to do anything about patriarchy, right? Or even like a non-binary Hispanic speaking lenders, right? That's not going to address the sexual, the gendered, and the racialized violence that happens to Hispanic workers, to Black non-reproductive workers in the home and in the community. And so I think that's it. We're really trying to get at how are these systems intertwined and how can we address the roots?
Yeah. Yeah. And I always just, when people are first thinking about these type of issues, the different types of critical reflection or kind of different schools of different critical theories are at first just helping us to acknowledge what's taking place and what the lived reality is. If you look at it from a kind of a systems perspective, like what is the system producing? And if you notice going on today, right, like that there's a growing awareness of the effectiveness of these types of theories, then you see not like engaging in theoretical reflection on the ground as a means of dismissing the insights. Now we just have the demonization of any tools that the underside of history use to point out exploitation. So like the Southern Baptists are like, we are critical race theories completely against us. And I'm like, probably it is. I mean,
yeah, it should be.
I'm not surprised, but I don't think you set this up as a way of repentance.
Yeah.
but like that you see this growing move in all these different courses, like the intellectual dark web joke. Like they're like, well, there's this cultural Marxism. And you're like, I don't even think you understand any of this. Yeah. But it's this means of like, let's figure out a way to even dismiss the critical reflective tools. Right, because we know what the truth happens if they're used, so we just have to like not use them. And I think that is, for me, it's been one of those things. Like in both the classroom and then with friends, it's like spend enough time to learn one of the tools and then help and see if it helps you. And like, does what it reveals to you when you say read Capital for the first time, like, does it make more sense of the problems that you as a Christian look at and go, this isn't good enough, right? Like you can't look at our world and go, the poverty that exists and continues to exist, the violence that is endemic in our culture, all this kind of stuff is good enough. You can't think the way you relate to the planet is livable. So something's wrong. And you know that you're on the side of life. If you are a person of faith, like you have to be on the side of a flourishing creation for all living things. So if that's the case, what are the tools that help us identify the problems? Because we all, as people of faith, want to recognize the dignity our neighbor has and their children have and all these types of things. And I think like helping people have that first encounter to think with different tools about the predicament is really helpful. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah, no, I think that's really great. And kind of alongside all the theory and the reading and conversations that we have, one thing I think that would be really powerful is for like pastors and ministers and laypersons kind of in community groups to encourage and to actually lead conversations that ask questions that where folks can kind of lean into and go deeper into their experiences, right? Asking questions around, okay, so do you feel like you have an equal amount of power in determining what's happening in your community? Do you even know what's happening in your neighborhood and your community? And, yes and no. And those kinds of questions can kind of, I think, help people start to think about what's happening in the world and why it's happening, right? Or what are some of the issues are you having? Are you worried about not enough money for retirement? Are you kind of frustrated with, you have frustrations at work or at home, right? And I think asking those questions again and bringing that alongside with the theory is just a really powerful way of highlighting the stories of the masses of working people right now. So.
No, that's great.
Cool.
So what's the next one? Each one of yours just gets me going. I'm having way too much fun. So
yeah, me too. This is fun. So actually, it's the fourth reason to go Christian Socialist is right along what you were naming at the end there. To me, we have to have some kind of vision an understanding of being human in relation to the other than human and non-human world. So Paul Tillich and process theology for me was really important in transitioning me out of my right-wing evangelicalism. And I think, process was just so fundamental and helpful for me to thinking about, I'm not just some kind of isolated atom or island that's outside of all relations, that's outside of all other people or systems or just the world, right? The planetary life. And I think that socialism, the war between socialism and capitalism isn't just about like who gets money, right? It's also about, it's deeply about transforming the ways in which we exist. And seizing human history but planetary history as well, and saying what kind of ways do we want to relate to, say, the whales, or the grass outside, the trees, the land, the water, the air, right? Because on one hand, we're wrapped up in it, but ruling capitalists, incredible mega corporations, there's just a few of them, are absolutely responsible for the mass destruction of the planet. But capitalism, imperialism, colonialism, right? There's this mass siege of both human and land for the sake of profit. And so I think if we want a world where we have clean air for all, access to free, clean water for all, why access to housing, right? These things are all intertwined. So I think the fourth reason for me is that I'd like to live in a world where we have just and life-affirming planetary relations, but that also requires a change in how we think about what it means to be human.
Oh, definitely. And I think that underneath that desire, you see a long logic from the Enlightenment on of silencing nature. So like once you get this kind of dualist vision of the world, where humans are the exception because we have a soul and the rest are function like machines, then like how you treat animals, how you treat the world, all of them become means to our ends. And that same logic then gets extended to native peoples, to slaves, right? Like what we did in the Enlightenment with the birth of capitalism is we came up with a logic that justified affirming the desires of those with possessions and capital in the market, and then silencing those that don't have what's necessary to exist in this system. Mm-hmm. And my next big book, I'm kind of like doing the genealogy of the way you see the connection between colonialism, racism, and the exploitation of nature playing out with in modern epistemology and economic theory. But like, and I think like the fruits of it, we're all starting to wake up to. And so for me, one of the fascinating things is like, when did it just become assumptions? When Greta Thunberg like sits there and just like calls out all these leaders, and then they get offended and they're like, oh, you're just being naive. But then like large numbers of young people are like, she's not being naive.
Yeah.
The reason they go, she's not being naive, is because they all know what that group of people think, and what they think and the assumptions they carry are ones where our grandkids don't breathe good. That's what we know. Like, don't tell me Davos. Like, next thing you're gonna say is we should be spraying shit up in the atmosphere to block the sun coming in. Like, you don't know, like you can't change the logic of the way you relate to the natural world, that you're just crushing up neighbors and nature in this machine. And so you're only wanting to preserve this. And so she calls you out and you get upset. And I think there's this growing group of people that go, this can't be the logic we run on. It just doesn't work. It just doesn't work. And one of the things for me is that like one of the things socialism helps point out is that what we treat as natural is an extremely important thing to reflect on. And for so many Christians that are connected to Western evangelism and the way it has spread across the globe and the way it's internalized in America, that what you assume is normal is the logic of the market. And it's not. It's a decision we make. And I feel like we're at this place where, where like Dr. Frankenstein went around, creates a monster. Now the monster's chasing you. and you're like, I can't believe this. We're being terrorized by a monster, but you made it. And they're just acting like it's normal for it to be there. And anyway, I so think that question, like, if you pay attention to nature, you either get smitten with some like techno eschatological vision of materialists and marketeers, or you go, maybe we got to rethink what we call natural, what we call normal, because these ways of relation are just not going to work.
Yeah, and that's a great point about like the whole experience with the monster too. And on one hand, it's not that we're just realizing that there's a monster and that we're like, oh, that sucks. I really don't like this monster. We're also mismonstering other, say, problems or other. We're unfortunately we're experiencing the exploitation and the suffering, and then we're saying, well, it must be immigrants who are stealing our jobs, right? That's happening both across Europe and the U.S. We go to racism, and we go to sexism, or we go to kind of this U.S. patriotism, rather than saying, no, the monster is there. We are actually frustrated, we're alienated, we're increasingly lonely and depressed and sad about life. We're frustrated kind of with how we're treated at work or in the community or at home. But instead of identifying the real monsters, we end up mismonstering.
Mismonstering, that's catchy.
Yeah, a little catchy word, yeah. Yeah.
All right, so you have one more.
Yeah, so we've had pharaoh-sex, we've had relationships matter. We've talked about how capitalism, white supremacy, colonialism and imperialism and heteropatriarchy are kind of all wrapped up. We've talked about the need to rethink how we exist on this planet and if we want to actually have a future on this planet. And then the last one is mostly just a deeply theological notion for me. Mark Lewis Taylor's The Executed God was a really, really important book for me in my journey. And so, and the language of the way of the cross has just continued to stick with me. I'm not for sure if it's James Cone or who it was, but a friend of mine, Chris Roof, pointed out to me at one point that there's almost like this, whether we win or lose, which I am not about losing. I'm not interested in losing. I want us to win a world. I want us to win a world of socialism and racial justice and gender justice, right? But whether we win or lose, I think there's this theological depth to embracing the fact that living in the way of Jesus, there will be crucifixion, there will be loss, there will be experiences of suffering. And one example that actually kind of pops into my mind is that we were just talking about realizing a world with better planetary relations. And recently we had the rise of the no DAPL resistance with indigenous water protectors. And folks, indigenous peoples who have been resisting U.S. colonization and imperialism for centuries now, they were out, they had set up a camp, and they were trying to prevent an oil company from basically destroying a nearby water source from the Standing Rock Reservation. And they were out resisting and protesting. The cops were called, a private security force was called, the military was called in, and they beat and they hosed down these indigenous water protectors. And there was violence. One person actually lost an eye, right? They permanently became disabled. And so, and actually at the very beginning of our conversation, Trip, we talked about how there was a working class struggle over 40 minutes away from me, right? Where workers were murdered in a fight with their boss. The way of the cross is serious, and I think the struggle for socialism and this commitment to realizing a better world, it's actually pretty scary, and we should name that. This isn't just something that we can vote this out of, right? We can't just vote ourselves out of capitalism or vote ourselves out of white supremacy and heteropatriarchy. These are things that we have to put our bodies and our lives on the line for. And I think, as scary as that sounds, there's this story about a God becoming human and having materially, in the flesh, being crucified amongst the crucified peoples. So that's a fifth reason. It's not a joyful and kind of exciting reason, but I do think it's like, if we're going to take this Christian thing seriously, or this Christian socialism thing seriously, I think that we have an example in the way of the cross, as told to us through the biblical and kind of Christian witness.
And I mean, you mentioned both the cross and also the incarnation. And I think, when you get the whole story of Jesus and then say it's connected to God, it's hard to imagine keeping a straight face and thinking it doesn't demand a type of allegiance and solidarity to the least of these, right? Like, it's just, if the incarnation is God's divine investment in material existence, and what does that investment look like? A confrontation with perverse religion and political power and societal structures, all the way to bearing the brunt of its violence. And then God's response is, no, you can't do that, right? Like, the resurrection is an insistence of God's desire for the transformation of a world riddled with our imperial oppressive violence. God has chosen sides, just like God did against Pharaoh. And so, yeah, like the Mark Taylor book's a really good one. And the executed God means for celebrating state executions today just seems problematic. Christian socialism isn't like the only, viable expression of Christianity, but it makes perfect sense why people would be attracted to it again in ways, because the heart of the ministry of Jesus and the big picture about who God is through incarnation, ministry, death, and resurrection is God taking sides. And so if you call Jesus Savior and Lord, then I think you know what to do. It's like, man, I don't know. I guess like once I would say like I identified as a Christian socialist, like in college, my junior year, I worked construction over the summer and was reading Paul Tillich's The Socialist Decision. I kind of did it for me, but it's wild to me that how often this as a live option for faithful Christians is just demonized and dismissed. But you know what isn't? Joel Osteen. Mm-hmm. Joel Osteen. This is why it drives me up the wall. I can guarantee you somebody's already emailed me. They haven't finished listening to this episode. And they did not email me and say, like, I think it's important for you to do a takedown of Joel Osteen. Like, a large portion of Christians in this country support things that are so antithetical to the gospel. Mm-hmm. But you know what? People get really worked up. Oh, no. Tripp had someone on that liked Marx too. They got excited. So anyway, I just feel like it's frustrating. And that's why I'm excited about the growth. That's why I'm interested in one, like, what got you to start the podcast, and like, what can you tell us about the fact that in the past 4 years, there's been an explosion of growth, millennials and younger in socialism, and a huge growth in just Christian socialists. In your kind of networking and experience there, like, what would you say is going on? And for those that are growing and maybe for the first time are starting to consider it or wanting to know how you connect with people past just listening to something, what kind of advice or wisdom would you give?
Yeah. So on the first piece, the short kind of the fast forward story of how I started to do the podcast was I grew up evangelical and I wanted to become a megachurch youth pastor. And then my pride, I got my ass kicked by a philosophy professor my very last semester of undergrad. And he actually wasn't even
metaphorically kicked, or like you got in a fight with him.
Well, no, it was metaphorically. I wanted to create a story there, but no, it was metaphorically, fortunately. So anyways, and that was so fundamental to starting to simply ask questions about my theology, about my politics, about my understanding of myself and my understanding of other people. And so then I just continued to ask questions for a while. Eventually I was a youth pastor. I got fired within the first year, unfortunately, fortunately, around questions of my thoughts on the Bible and sexuality. And so that kind of fast forward, I was going to go part-time seminary, but and ended up, I fell in love with education that last semester of undergrad. I went into seminary, and then my first semester of college, Michael Brown was murdered. And so I was in a community that really challenged me in my whiteness and my assumptions about race and gender and sexuality. And so for the next 5 years, I felt like I was really pushed to think critically about social justice. But through that time, I also was asking questions around, well, how about poverty, right? Poverty was kind of like a social justice thing. And over time, I dove into like mass incarceration and the policing and imprisonment patterns in the U.S. And you end up reading Black radicals, and they clearly make the connection between capitalism, white supremacy, and patriarchy here in the U.S., and also kind of, again, like imperialism and colonialism across the world. So that was kind of like my way in. And eventually, right after I turned in my thesis on incarceration, capitalism, and white supremacy, I dove into Jörg Rieger, and Rieger helped expand my thinking. And after that, I just kind of dove straight into Marxism. It really expanded my analysis of what's happening to labor, what's happening to the planet, and then how that's connected to imperialism and colonialism. So that's the fast forward track. When I started Faith and Capital, about a year and a half, or actually we're going up on 2 years in March. I was just learning. I literally just starting to read Marxist analysis and anti-colonial analysis. So it's been a great journey for me. And I think I hope I journey until I die. I'll always be asking new questions. And that's both a dialectically materialist kind of approach to things. It's also a very process approach to things. And it's also hopefully in that tradition where my professor kicked my ass and he said, you need to be fucking humble. You do not know everything. You do not know the world. We might have a passion for people, and that needs to be connected with that continual critical analysis and that open to reflection and being critiqued. I love that. So that's kind of like the short story of how we got to Faith and Capital.
Yeah, and I'll make sure there are links and everything on the website and stuff. So how would you describe the kind of, I don't know, growth and interest in religious forms of socialism?
So there's an interesting kind of assumption, I think, that's pretty widespread across Christian circles, or perhaps like academic and theological circles, is that, well, if we could just kind of transform the thinking of the church, then you can transform the thinking and way of being of the world. And I think there's an underestimation about how material forces, social, political, economic forces actually impacts and shapes the church. So on one hand, I do think there are kind of small groups of Christians who are making these connections on a personal level. And I'm hoping it's more of a community and collective effort moving, that we'll start to see in the next decade or two. But I also think that the shifts economically and politically that are happening in the world right now, both in the US, but really across the world, that's really shaping the church. That's shaping how folks think about the question of capitalism and socialism, and how that relates to the fact that we're still going out and protesting, right? The murders and the assassinations of Black folk on the ground, or the mass unemployment that's happening with a virus, right? People are asking questions, and they're swinging right to kind of explicit racist, misogynist fascism, or they're swinging left and saying there's actually structural systemic issues that need to be toppled. And I guess on one hand, some folks are swinging towards Christian socialism with the hope that we can kind of vote our way out of capitalism, vote our way out of these systems of death and domination. But I do think that, as a revolutionary socialist, there's important kind of anti-imperialist and anti-colonial analysis that's pushed me to say bigger revolutionary seasons will have to occur if we're going to be able to actually topple these systems of death and domination. So for me, I think, Christians are just kind of thinking about their situations, thinking about what's happening in the world. Unfortunately, there's a few of us. It's growing, but there's still a very, very small few of us. And they're saying, well, what does this mean for me as a Christian? Because Christianity for me all I've heard is Dave Ramsey. All I've heard is Joel Osteen, right? It's supposed to be like, I'm supposed to feel happy. I'm supposed to, worry about my investments. I'm supposed to try and climb the ladder. But now we're starting to think, well, maybe Christianity is something that can't, or our Christian faith at least, is actually the enemy of capitalism. It's the enemy of structural white supremacy.
No. I mean, I think that there's, there's definitely kind of, different strands in whatever you'd call the Christian left, those that are like invested in the structure, transforming the structures that are the case, or that think it's necessary to have a significant revolution of, the organizing structures and such. My thought about it is like, who knows which one will end up being right. So like, I want to just be generally supportive of of something that's not neoliberal capitalism. And in the meantime, until there's a moment of huge sweeping change, I'm deeply invested in whatever approximations we can to respond to the environmental crisis, because most of the outlooks for how it's going to affect the global poor in the next 100 years are going to make world wars look small in death toll, and minor changes in the next 50 years can have significant impact on the poor there. But I think it's sad that that's like your option for thinking I don't know. Donald Trump is the only reason I like. He's really good at making someone like me get out of bed to cheer on Joe Biden. It's like, what's required to get pumped about a moderate neoliberal? Neo-fascist. That just really inspires to care, and that's depressing to me. It's where we're in a situation where in the United States, you're trying to decide as someone's more progressive, what do you do with a two-party system that basically that is funded by the same people, and you're kind of slightly steering the ship one way or the other, and the one that's a little more sane on the environment is the one that's more likely to send us to war. That's just a horrible situation.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. You've named a couple really, really powerful kind of political and social things that are happening right now, right? You have climate catastrophe. People are asking, okay, how did we get here, right? And there's tons of different narratives going on that people are kind of choosing from. And then there's fascism, right? A lot of us in the U.S., I remember when 4 years ago, when Trump defeated Hillary in the election, at first I kind of turned to my right-wing conservative family and friends and community, and I wanted to ask, well, how could you, right? How could you do this? And there were a lot of different kind of ways of thinking about that were being shared. But then at some point, not for sure how or when or why, but I started to ask myself, well, how have I participated in the production of a situation, of a moment in history in which a person like Donald Trump could win the presidency? And that really started to kind of push me away from thinking that liberalism's project of just kind of being nicer and including people into this kind of status quo is the project that's really going to save us. And you also mentioned neoliberalism. And I think historically people are starting to wrestle with, we're 50 years into a neoliberal kind of global capitalism, and that's killing people at a more rapid race. And it's also just people are feeling the oppression and the exploitation in their communities and in their homes more often or more intensely as well. So yeah, U.S. is a dying empire. Neoliberal capitalism has just made life really shitty for more and more people. And fascism threatens us socially, politically, economically. And then there's an environmental disaster. And so those things are, I think, touching more and more people rather than making people feel like, well, I just want to live a normal life and I can kind of just check out, go to school, get my job, retire.
I wish there was a live option to just go get your job, work, retire, and you're not anxious. right? Like,
Yeah, absolutely.
that's just not even a live option for most people. And that's why I was having a conversation with two, who, if you did analysis, would be very, deeply resonating, but they're like the 2 generations older, like retired theological ethics professors who are like, yeah, but I mean, we have to basically like work in the system that's there and kind of like, change it and stuff. And I'm like, I guess that's what you're going to do. But I was like, you see, the thing that and I brought this up, I was like, y'all act like you handed us on something we want, and one of them's like, Trip, but like, you're doing good. And like you're at a prestigious school doing a postdoc, like you did your PhD, and you have a podcast and 70,000 people listen to you all the time talk about your stuff. Like, come on, like you got a book, all this. And I'm like, you think I want to do this? Like, I couldn't use my PhD or my ministerial thing and like have the type of investment in my kids if I wasn't doing all the stuff I have to do. Like, if I could go back and tell Trip, just don't go to grad school and get student loans and come up with some trade, avoid debt, and then church plant in ways like you don't have to compromise your integrity all the time. Like, I'm very tempted to go do it. You know what I wouldn't have ever done? I wouldn't have moved away from my family for essentially 12 years, and my kids would know their cousins and grandparents, and like I could still go fishing in the same places. And then you move, jumping through hoops, you get more debt, and then like you have arrived, and then you realize like you're relationally deficient and you have no options. You're already enslaved to a system that says like you have to do all these things because you said yes when you were 18 to go to this school, and then you said yes at 22 because you were taking all the advice from your teachers and your mentors and stuff who are like, this is how you succeed, right? And a lot of people be like, oh well, Trip, like you're doing good and all this kind of stuff, but no one goes like, would you like to undo it? Now think of all my peers that are adjuncting like 13 classes at different schools.
Yep.
Or my friends that have divinity school loans who are working at a church and never telling the truth. Like, there's so many growing number of people who, if you ask them to opt out of their agreements they made with our current order when they were 20 and just hit the reset button, they would. If you want to know why they don't want to forgive student loan debt, I think we all know why. It's because you have no interest in people living with deep integrity and convictions and having the possibility of flourishing relationships without the demand put on it by large amounts of debt. Like, they don't. And I just don't understand. Like, when I was sitting there talking with these guys, I'm like, you are part of a system that made us. And I'm sure you feel guilty about it. I don't know if I would have done any different if I was in your shoes, because your experience has been, you do this, it works. I'm telling you, it doesn't work anymore. And most of us that have jumped through these hoops, like growing numbers of us are like, I didn't have an opt-out, so now I have to just keep playing the game. And I think that like when that number gets big enough and it keeps getting bigger, the idea that Joe Biden's a solution is just not going to work. Absolutely. And now you have a whole bunch of us that are looking at our kids going, I don't even know what to do for them. Yeah. What do? Do I exploit more people, make more money, save it so they can win at a game I hate being in and I know kills people on the planet? That's what I'm stuck doing as a parent. I don't like, you see like what I'm saying? Like when people go like, oh, Trip, I think this is crazy analysis. Oh, I don't know. Well, yeah, but if I want my kids to have a semi-secure future in a growing competitive death dealing one, I have to train them to win on Pharaoh's rules. And I hate what it's doing to me and my family. Why would I want to give that to my kids? But the idea of them not being in it, I don't even know what a live option is.
Yeah.
This is why I think that people need to just like wake up, like and I know I'm not alone, and I'm doing better than a lot of my peers.
Yeah. And I think you're right in that there's a large group of population who have relatively been able to live comfortably for a long period of time in certain imperialist nations like in Europe and in the US and Canada. But more and more of us, we're still of the working class, but our comfortability is being undermined, right? So in the beginning of the 20th century, there were 2 world wars. And in the US, there was incredible kind of anti-racist and working class and feminist movement happening. And the ruling class conceded. Okay, incredible socialist and communist organizing was happening, but the ruling class conceded, and they gave incredible degrees of things called unemployment, right, or job guarantees. But they gave it to a portion of the working class, the white male working class, and so life actually was fairly comfortable for folks who were racialized as white, or if you kind of conceded and said, yes, I'll join in this nuclear family relation. But that divided the working class, that undermines that happened on top of of land that was still being, continues to be stolen from indigenous nations. And so I think there's all these kind of games that we play in our head where we tell ourselves it's not that bad for me right now. Like there's people out there who have it worse. So I shouldn't complain, which I think is just like capitalist ideology to a T. And then there's also the lie that it's like, well, if we just kind of make things a little bit better now, right? It's not just neoliberal capitalism, but if we just kind of have a capitalism with a friendly face, let's have housing, let's cancel debt, and then we'll kind of like restart for a little bit. What history tells us is exactly what's happening right now. Fascism is on the rise, and people, imperialist nations are going to war. And so I think we can imagine a world where we just have it comfortably and we get to sit and play church. But especially right now, this political moment in history, we are moving into a very tumultuous social, political, economic situation. And hopefully more folks do think about why do I have these really shitty choices, as you said? Why do I have to choose between taking advantage of other people, literally harming them, extracting more wealth from them, just so I can be comfortable? Why is that the choice? Between that and, say, like just being a little poor or something like that. That's not the world that I want to live in. And I don't think that's the world that many Christians feel compelled deep inside them to pursue.
Yeah, I agree. That's why I think people should at least think going Christian Socialist is a live option. And then they can all go to Faith and Capital and get a full healthy dose on a weekly basis. We
can journey together. Yeah, we can definitely journey together.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for hanging out, Chase.
Chip, yeah, it's been a blast. I was really appreciative of you letting me come on and chatting with me. I appreciate you, buddy.
Whoa, you made it all the way to the end of an episode. That's amazing. You're so cool, so awesome. You listened all this way. You want to be part of a really cool collection of people that also listen to the episodes all the way, like some of the brand new members to the Homebrewed community, individuals who went to homebrewedcommunity.com, signed up, joined our private Facebook group, got access to the members-only podcast feed. Amazing people like James M., Brian R., Ronnie S., David E., Jill O., Judy H., Casey C., Brandon V., and Ron T., all new members of the Homebrewed community. Yeah, so join the people. Find your theological nerdy friends. Get to give more input on the direction of the podcast. Join the community. Homebrewedcommunity.com.